From faithful soldier to betrayed husband. My wife's open marriage ultimatum and its fallout. I first met Angela a decade ago at a friend's backyard barbecue in San Diego, California. The sun was blazing, the music was upbeat, and the smell of grilled hot dogs and burgers filled the air. We ended up chatting near a folding table stacked with paper plates and plastic cups, both of us juggling drinks and introductions. It was one of those easy, organic conversations. She told me about her work as a fourth-grade teacher, and I shared my experiences in the Marine Corps. From that very first talk, I could tell she had a blend of warmth and self-confidence that left me wanting to know more. Fast forward 3 years from that day, and we were standing in front of family and friends, exchanging vows on a breezy beach not too far from Coronado. While we've known each other for a full 10 years now, we've been married for 7. In those 7 years, I've been deployed or stationed away from home for roughly half of them. I serve as a logistics officer, which means coordinating everything from the transportation of supplies to the scheduling of troop movements. It's a role I'm proud of, but it also demands a lot of time spent overseas or at bases around the country. Angela always insisted she understood this life. After all, her father had served in the Navy for most of her childhood, so she grew up accustomed to the idea of someone coming and going with duty schedules and deployments. In the early stages of our relationship, she'd shrug and say, "Long distance is tough, but we'll get through it." It reassured me to have a partner who wouldn't be blindsided by the irregular hours and prolonged absences. Despite the challenges, we built a pretty comfortable life together. My annual income, combined with benefits, hovers around 6 figures, which has given us the freedom to purchase a cozy 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburb just outside San Diego. Angela still teaches, which she loves, and she also uses her free time to pursue painting. Her home studio is filled with half-finished canvases that somehow always look better than anything I could do. Our home might not be extravagant, but it's ours. A small front yard with succulents lining the walkway, and a back patio where we host casual weekend get-togethers whenever I'm back on shore leave. We talked about starting a family almost from the moment we got engaged. That was one of those big topics, kids, careers, and how to handle deployments, that we hashed out before tying the knot. Angela made it clear she wasn't ready to be a near-single parent, raising a child alone for months at a time while I was overseas. I agreed it would be best to wait until I could potentially land a more stable, desk-oriented position or at least minimize my time away. We both wanted to ensure that when we did have a child, they'd have both parents around, not just me popping in and out of their life. For the better part of 7 years, this plan worked smoothly. We fell into a routine. Video calls whenever possible, texts that sometimes had to wait days to send, and care packages she'd mail to wherever I was stationed. I'd come home to a house brimming with warmth, art supplies scattered around, lesson plans piled on the kitchen table, and Angela ready to fill me in on everything I'd missed. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and we believed we had it all figured out. I'll never forget the night that changed everything. I was stationed overseas, wrapping up another hectic day of managing supply routes and ensuring our unit had what it needed. By the time I got to my bunk and logged onto our scheduled video call, it was morning back home in San Diego. The connection was surprisingly clear, and Angela's face lit up the screen like it always did, her smile a welcome sight after 12 hours of constant movement. We started off discussing the usual updates, her students, my workload, any news around the neighborhood. She seemed a bit distant, but not unusually so. I chalked it up to the occasional tension of long-distance conversations. Then, almost out of nowhere, she said, "There's something I need to talk to you about." She paused, almost as if she was reconsidering whether to continue, but then she pressed on. "I've been thinking a lot lately about us, and about how much time we spend apart." I leaned forward, expecting some talk about me requesting a transfer or us finally deciding on when to start a family. Instead, she said the 3 words I never would have anticipated from my wife: "Open our marriage." First, I thought she was joking. I gave a half-hearted chuckle, waiting for a punchline that never arrived. Angela didn't waver. Her expression remained serious. She launched into an explanation about her growing frustration with living the better part of a year without me, about her physical and emotional needs, and how she felt she was wasting her prime years waiting for my deployments to end. I want to explore what it's like to be with someone else, she said, her eyes searching mine through the camera. I love you, and this has nothing to do with wanting to leave, but I can't keep burying my needs for 6 months at a time. I deserve more. My stomach sank like a stone. It felt as if the ground beneath me had opened up, leaving me free-falling into a reality where all our past promises and future plans were suddenly up for debate. This wasn't just a casual discussion about spicing things up. It was a blatant challenge to the very commitment we'd built our marriage on. We'd always agreed that fidelity was non-negotiable, no matter how difficult the deployments became. Knowing that her father had served for years, I'd believed Angela had a clear-eyed acceptance of our situation. Now, it seemed she had reached her limit. A rush of emotions hit me. Betrayal, shock, anger, heartbreak. We had built a life around mutual trust and the promise that no matter where I was sent, she would remain my anchor. What are you saying? I managed, my voice a ragged whisper. You want to see other people while we're still married? She nodded, stressing that she would still be loyal in every other sense. She insisted she loved me deeply but needed something more to cope with my absences. It was almost impossible to process. Our marriage had been predicated on openness, yes, but openness in communication, not in welcoming third parties into our relationship. I felt blindsided, like the strong foundation we'd painstakingly laid was suddenly riddled with cracks. Angela argued that she had earned this right after enduring years of my deployments, that she had been patient and supportive far longer than most would. But in my mind, that same support and patience was what made our bond sacred. Suggesting she could bring another man into her life, into our marriage, ran counter to every value we had promised to uphold. In that single conversation, an invisible line was crossed, and I realized we were standing on opposite sides of a canyon we might never bridge again. The days following Angela's bombshell declaration felt like an emotional whirlpool. I was still deployed, so our communication was limited to shaky video calls and sporadic emails. Every time I tried to reason with her, suggest counseling, ask her to reconsider, she'd remain firm. This isn't a request. It's already decided. I couldn't believe how suddenly she'd flipped our marriage on its head. The Angela I had known, the woman who had once seemed so patient and supportive, now sounded like a stranger. As the weeks wore on, her tone shifted from apologetic to almost dismissive. She began emphasizing how lonely she'd been and how unrealistic it was to expect her to wait half a year every time I left. I remember one call in particular where she bluntly stated, "Don't you think I have the right to experience intimacy whenever I want?" My mind couldn't keep pace with the betrayal I was feeling. It wasn't just physical intimacy she was talking about. It was our entire concept of fidelity, now being tossed aside like it was optional. A gnawing suspicion took hold. Was there already someone else? Some of her social media posts alluded to a new fitness routine, praising her personal trainer for his motivation. She'd tag the gym's location, post photos of herself in workout gear, and mention how this trainer had inspired her to make lifestyle changes. It didn't take a detective to read between the lines. I confronted her, asking point-blank if this trainer was the reason she wanted an open marriage. She never admitted it outright, but her evasive answers and sudden defensiveness only deepened my suspicions. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep funneling money into a joint account that she might be using to fund her newfound freedom. I revoked her access to certain credit cards and rerouted my paychecks into a private account. The day I made that decision, I felt a pang of guilt. After all, this was my wife and we had built our finances together. But that guilt quickly faded when Angela responded with anger, accusing me of punishing her for being honest about her needs. To me, it felt less like honesty and more like betrayal. Once I was back stateside, I refused to stay in our house. Sleeping in the same bed where she might have been with someone else was unimaginable. I rented a small apartment closer to base, determined to maintain my dignity and sanity. Angela, on the other hand, seemed equally determined to provoke me. She began posting photos on social media, nights out at upscale clubs, dinner dates at fancy restaurants, pictures that always hinted at another person just out of frame. The captions ranged from cryptic quotes about living life to the fullest to outright flirtatious commentary. It was as if she was advertising her newly liberated status. Friends and family started noticing. I told a few trusted people the truth. Angela wanted an open marriage and I wasn't on board. Word spread quickly, especially through the tight-knit community of military spouses. Suddenly, the same circle of friends that once invited Angela to barbecues and holiday gatherings began distancing themselves. She had, in their eyes, crossed an unspoken line. It wasn't simply about her wanting other relationships. It was about the way she was flaunting it and disregarding the very core of a marital commitment. The fallout was swift. A couple of my fellow officers and their wives, who had always been supportive of us, reached out, offering a listening ear or a place to crash if I ever needed it. Others cut off contact with Angela entirely, not wanting to be associated with the drama. She found herself increasingly isolated, and I could sense her growing resentment toward me for ruining her image. But the reality was, she was the one who had chosen this path. Things escalated quickly from that point. Arguments turned into radio silence. I blocked her on most social media platforms, not wanting to see the steady stream of suggestive posts. She left me angry voicemails and sent texts accusing me of abandoning her. All I could do was remind myself that she'd effectively ended our traditional marriage the moment she announced she was pursuing other men. We were on a collision course with a future neither of us had planned for, each day pushing us further apart and intensifying the conflict that now defined our lives. Filing for divorce was never something I'd imagined doing, especially not so abruptly. I'd always pictured Angela and me working through any issues that came our way. After all, we'd been partners for a decade, leaning on each other through deployments and long stretches of separation. But her decision to open our marriage without my consent had dissolved the foundation of trust we'd built. Eventually, I realized that remaining legally bound served no purpose except to drag us both through more pain. So, with a heavy heart, I contacted a lawyer and began the paperwork. The day I signed the initial documents, I felt a mixture of relief and profound sadness. A huge part of me wanted to cling to the life we had, to the memories of weekend breakfasts and playful banter in the kitchen. But that life was gone, replaced by secrecy, betrayal, and a refusal on her part to acknowledge the damage. Filing those papers was a final stand for my own dignity, a line in the sand that said, I respect myself enough not to stay in a relationship where I'm treated like an option. Angela found out about my decision through a courtesy notification sent by my attorney. She wasn't pleased. A couple of days later, I was just getting off work when I heard a firm knock on the door of my rented apartment. My heart pounded because I knew exactly who stood on the other side. Sure enough, when I opened it, there she was, eyes puffy from either crying or lack of sleep, and arms crossed defensively over her chest. She said she wanted to talk. At first, I hesitated, unsure if I could handle more emotional turmoil, but I let her in. We stood awkwardly in the narrow living room, the only sound the hum of the old air conditioner. She started by saying she didn't want a divorce, that she still loved me, and that this open marriage thing was meant to bring her happiness, not destroy our life together. The way she spoke, alternating between defensive justifications and pleas for my sympathy, only solidified my resolve. I told her plainly that our marriage, as we had known it, no longer existed. She had made her choice, disregarding every boundary we'd agreed upon. There was no going back, no unseeing the damage. Her eyes filled with tears, and she demanded to know why I wasn't willing to try. Because you didn't ask if we could try, I said. You told me point blank that this was happening. You never considered my feelings, just your own. I don't know if my words got through to her, but I stood firm. In the aftermath, Angela began to experience the broader social repercussions of her decision. She had once enjoyed the camaraderie of military spouses who understood the hardships of deployments. Now, many of them kept their distance, disapproving of how she had publicly flaunted her plan to see other men while I was serving overseas. The upscale dinner invitations dried up. The friendly weekend brunches vanished. Even her parents, who had initially tried to see both sides, began asking her tough questions about what had really happened. She realized, perhaps too late, that her financial stability had been intertwined with our marriage. My salary covered the mortgage, insurance, and extras that allowed her to live comfortably without significant worry about bills. In an instant, that cushion evaporated. She might have been ready to embrace a new lifestyle in theory, but the reality hit harder when she lost the network of friends and the financial safety net she'd relied on. Standing in my apartment that day, I saw clearly that the final page in our shared story was turning. It wasn't an angry moment so much as it was painfully definitive. I knew then that I couldn't return to what we once were, and she knew I meant every word. The divorce proceedings would move forward, sealing the end of what had once been a promising, loving marriage, and marking the irreversible point at which there was simply no turning back. The divorce process moved quicker than I'd anticipated, mostly because I refused to engage in lengthy back-and-forth discussions about reconciliation. My lawyer laid out the timeline. We'd file, wait for a court date, and then either settle the details or proceed to a final hearing. Angela, however, seemed intent on dragging the process out. One week, she'd call me in tears, saying she was willing to end her open marriage experiment if I would only give us one more chance. The next, she'd send scathing messages, blaming me for ruining her life and threatening to fight tooth and nail for every penny of our joint assets. It was emotionally exhausting. She also tried enlisting help from my parents, reaching out to them with emotional appeals. My mother, always polite, let her speak her piece but remained unmoved. She told Angela flatly that while she sympathized with the strain of having a husband deployed, she couldn't understand how opening the marriage without mutual agreement did anything but harm. My dad was less diplomatic. He refused to pick up her calls after the first attempt, making it clear whose side he was on. My younger brother, who had been close to Angela before all this, also cut ties. Once he learned about the situation and her determination to see other men, he wanted nothing more to do with her. Even a few of our mutual friends, who initially tried to remain neutral, distanced themselves once the details became public. In the meantime, the house in San Diego, our 3-bedroom home with the yard we'd painstakingly landscaped, became another point of contention. After much back and forth, we agreed to put it on the market. I couldn't bear the idea of living there anymore. Every room held memories now tainted by Angela's choices. She insisted she wanted to keep it, but her income alone wasn't enough to handle the mortgage. For a while, she thought maybe her parents would step in and help financially, but they refused to enable what they saw as her self-destructive behavior. In the end, the for sale sign went up on the front lawn, and before long, a new family was touring the property, ready to make it their own. Without the financial cushion my salary had provided, Angela soon learned how expensive life could be. Designer clothes, high-end gym memberships, and weekend getaways were no longer within easy reach on a teacher's paycheck. Meanwhile, her social circle continued to shrink. The same friends who once joined her for brunch and shopping sprees began to ghost her messages. The local community of military spouses wanted nothing to do with someone who'd publicly undermined the idea of remaining faithful during deployments. She found herself in a lonely place, juggling both the regret of her actions and the growing realization that she'd lost the advantages that came with being part of a committed partnership. For me, despite the inevitable sadness of closing this chapter, I felt an odd sense of relief. Moving into my new apartment closer to base gave me a fresh start. I no longer had to wonder what was happening in my own home while I was deployed, or whether my trust was being compromised by someone I loved. My family and a few steadfast friends rallied around me, helping me decorate the new place and adjust to a single life I hadn't known in years. I threw myself into my work, spending extra hours on base, training with my unit, and taking on responsibilities that kept my mind focused and my heart steady. As the final court date loomed, it became clear there was no turning back. We'd each made our decisions, and no amount of pleading or raging on Angela's part could patch up what had been broken. Our marriage was effectively over. The legal paperwork was just a formality. And although I would always remember the good times we'd shared, I couldn't shake the conviction that my future was better off without the perpetual uncertainty and betrayal. By the time the ink dried on the divorce papers, I knew I was already moving on. Free to live by my own standards, with no regrets about leaving behind a life that had become unrecognizable. Since the divorce was finalized, I've experienced an unexpected sense of calm. Don't get me wrong. There were plenty of days when I questioned everything, wondering if I should have fought harder to save the marriage or tried to compromise in some way. But each time those doubts crept in, I reminded myself that no partnership could survive when one person unilaterally decides to break the fundamental rules. Once I recognized that Angela's choice had shattered our bond beyond repair, I was finally able to let go of any lingering guilt and move on. It hasn't been a quick or painless process, but every step forward feels lighter, almost like shedding an old skin that no longer fits. My routine has settled into a new normal. I'm still stationed in San Diego, though now I live in a modest apartment closer to the base. The place is smaller than the house we once shared, but it suits me. No more reminders of what went wrong. I've started dedicating more time to my personal fitness and even signed up for night classes to earn additional certifications that could help my career. The Marine Corps has always been a source of pride and purpose for me, and focusing on my service brings a renewed sense of direction. I also catch up with friends more often, going out for casual dinners or weekend hikes. Many of them were a huge support during the worst of the turmoil, reminding me that I'm not alone and that life does go on, even after a painful betrayal. As for Angela, I hear bits and pieces through mutual acquaintances and the occasional social media post I stumble across. She ended up renting a small condo not too far from her teaching job. Without the financial safety net we once shared, she's had to tighten her belt substantially. No more luxury outings or high-end gym memberships. From what I gather, a good portion of her old social circle has distanced themselves, particularly those in the military community who viewed her decision as a direct slap in the face to spouses who remain faithful during deployments. Some even felt personally insulted, as if her actions reflected poorly on the sacrifices they, too, have made for their families. I've heard rumors that Angela regrets how it all went down, that she wishes she could rewind and handle things differently. But at this point, it's too late to change the past, and I'm no longer interested in revisiting that pain. Looking back, the entire experience tested my understanding of commitment, loyalty, and self-worth. There's an old saying, "We accept the love we think we deserve." For a long time, I believed I deserved love from Angela, even if it came wrapped in ultimatums and half-truths. But realizing that I deserve better, a partner who respects me and stands beside me through adversity, became my turning point. I've learned that boundaries are crucial. It's not selfish or cruel to stand up for yourself when someone else disregards your feelings and the promises you built your life around. I'm not naive enough to think I won't carry scars from this chapter, but I refuse to let it define me or dictate my future. If I ever choose to remarry or settle down again, it will be with someone who shares my core values. A person who sees fidelity not as a burden but as a mutual cornerstone of trust. Until then, I'm content focusing on my career, nurturing the friendships that stayed true, and enjoying the quiet freedom of a life where I get to decide who I am and what I stand for. I left that old version of my life behind without regret, stepping forward into whatever comes next, certain I made the right choice for my own dignity and peace of mind.